I was a Saudi royal who read the Bible out loud at a family dinner just to make everyone laugh at Christians. But before I finished the first chapter, something happened inside me that no amount of royal blood or religious training could explain. And what does it mean when the God you are trying to humiliate is the one who ends up finding you first? My name is Zaid and I am 26 years old. I grew up inside walls that most people in the world will never see from the outside. Our family compound in Riyadh sat behind iron gates on a street where every house belonged to someone connected to power. The ceilings in our main hall were 40 feet high. The marble floors were so polished, you could see your own face in them if you looked down while you walked. I learned to walk on those floors before I was 2 years old, and by the time I could run, I already understood something that took most people their whole lives to figure out. Our family was not like other families, and our name carried weight that ordinary names did not, and that weight had a price. My father, Prince Mansour, was a man who filled every room he entered without raising his voice. He did not need to raise it. When he spoke, people turned. When he sat, people stood straighter. He had the kind of authority that does not come from being loud but from never having been questioned. He had never been questioned in his life. Not by friends, not by subordinates, not by anyone in our family. And certainly not by his sons. He had 4 sons. I was the second. The one everyone said had the sharpest mind. The one who made people laugh. The one who could take any argument apart in under 10 minutes and leave the pieces on the floor with a smile on his face. My father loved this about me. He brought me into rooms where other men were debating and let me speak. He watched the people's faces when I dismantled their positions. He never said he was proud out loud. He showed it by putting me in rooms where my mind could be used. That was how he showed love. By using you for what you were good at. My mother, Hessa, was gentle and deeply faithful. She prayed all 5 prayers without exception. She read Quran every morning before anyone else in the house woke up. She did not debate or argue about religion. She simply lived it quietly and completely, the way a river lives its direction without announcing where it is going. She was the warmest person in our compound and the one most certain about God, not in a loud way, in a settled way. Like a tree that has been in the ground so long it no longer worries about wind. I was not like her. I loved Islam the way you love the country you were born in, automatically, without examination. It was the water I swam in, and I did not think about the water. I fasted during Ramadan because everyone fasted. I prayed because praying was what we did. I could quote Quran verses accurately and debate Islamic theology competently because those were skills my father valued, and I was good at learning what my father valued. But faith, the personal living kind my mother had, the kind that made her wake up before the sun to sit quietly with God, I did not have that. I had knowledge and performance. I did not know yet that they were different things. At 22, I went to study law at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. My father sent his sons abroad for education the way our family had done for 3 generations. Edinburgh was cold and grey and full of rain that arrived sideways of the water. I wore too many layers for the first month and gradually figured out the rhythm of a city that had been enduring that weather for centuries and had decided to simply live around it rather than complain. I was good at university. I was good at almost everything that involved taking ideas apart and putting them back together differently. My law professors liked me. My classmates liked me. I had a sharp sense of humor and a quick way of talking that moved faster than most people expected from someone with my background, as though they expected a Saudi royal to be stiff and ceremonial. I was not. I was irreverent and quick, and I enjoyed making people laugh with observations about the gap between how things were supposed to be and how they actually were. It was at Edinburgh that I first started treating Christianity as a source of comedy, not viciously. I was not a cruel person, but I had grown up in a world where Christianity was understood to be a corruption of God's original message, a religion that had taken the prophet Jesus and made him into a god through a process of historical distortion, driven by a man named Paul who had never even met Jesus. I knew these arguments thoroughly. My Islamic education had given me a complete framework for dismissing Christian claims. The Trinity was logically incoherent. God becoming a human baby was undignified. The idea that God's Son had to die to satisfy God's justice was, to my mind, self-contradicting and almost absurd when you said it out loud. I found that saying it out loud to British students who were vaguely Christian, in the way most people in Britain were vaguely Christian, meaning they had been to a church for a funeral or two and celebrated Christmas without particularly thinking about what it meant, produced reliable laughter and confused silence. They did not have good answers. They had not thought carefully about what they actually believed. And I was very good at identifying the weakest point in any position and pressing on it in a way that was funny enough that the person being pressed did not realize how completely they were losing until the room was already laughing. By my third year at Edinburgh, I had developed a kind of informal reputation as the person you did not want to debate about religion if you were Christian. Not because I was mean about it, because I was precise and quick, and I made the whole exercise feel slightly embarrassing for anyone on the other side. I enjoyed this more than I should have. It gave me a feeling of intellectual superiority that I told myself was just confidence. In my final year, a classmate named Thomas invited me to his family's home for Christmas. He was from a Scottish family outside the city. His father a farmer, his mother a primary school teacher, but their house full of the kind of cheerful noise that big families in cold countries generate when they are all in the same room with enough food and a working fireplace. I went partly because I was curious and partly because I had no plans, and partly, I will admit now, because I thought it would be entertaining. After dinner on Christmas Eve, Thomas's father sat in the chair nearest the fire and opened a Bible and read from Luke, the story of the birth of Jesus. Shepherds and angels, and a baby in a feeding trough. The family sat around him, listening with the kind of quiet attention that I associated with my mother reading Quran in the morning. That particular stillness that people show when they are not just hearing words but receiving them. I sat slightly to the side, watching all of this with the detached amusement of someone observing a cultural ritual they found interesting but not personally relevant. But I noticed something I had not expected to notice. These people were not performing. Thomas's father was not doing anything for show. He read the way my mother prayed, like it was real, like the words were addressing someone who was actually present in the room. His wife watched him with the expression of a woman who had heard this same reading every Christmas for 30 years and still found it worth hearing. Thomas's younger sister, maybe 12 years old, Boris sat cross-legged on the rug with her chin in her hands, completely still, which was the opposite of how she had been during dinner. The story had her completely. I looked at that girl and felt something I could not name, not mockery, something quieter. I pushed it away and made a small joke to Thomas as we went to bed about the biological impossibility of the virgin birth. He laughed politely. But that night I lay in the guest room in the dark and I thought about his father's face by the firelight. I thought about my mother's face by morning light in our compound in Riyadh. The expression was the same settled certainty, the same real presence. I did not know what to do with that. So I did what I usually did with things I could not immediately explain. I filed it away and moved past it. I graduated and returned to Riyadh with a law degree and more material than ever for arguing that Christianity was an intellectually indefensible religion that reasonable people had outgrown. I was 25 years old and I was completely certain about this. I had no idea that within 1 year I would be sitting in my father's house reading a Bible out loud to my family as a joke, and that the joke would stop being funny about halfway through the first chapter, and that nothing I thought I knew about God would survive the next 12 months intact. I had been back in Riyadh for 4 months when the Bible reading happened. It started at a dinner in my father's house on a Friday evening. The family gathered regularly for these dinners, My father and mother, my older brother Saad, my younger brothers Nabil and Jassim, several cousins, and uncle. The table was long and full of food, and the conversation moved fast the way it always did, in a room full of people who had grown up competing to be the most interesting person speaking. Someone mentioned a colleague who had recently converted to Christianity, a Saudi man from a respected family who had gone abroad for work and come back a different person. The table reacted the way our table always reacted to this kind of news, with a mix of genuine concern about the man's spiritual state and barely concealed curiosity about how it had happened, and more than a little contempt for the religion he had converted to. My father shook his head slowly. My uncle said something about how Western education weakened a man's faith if he was not already rooted deeply enough. My older brother Saad said Christians worshipped 3 gods, and anyone who thought carefully for 10 minutes could see the Trinity made no sense at all. I had a Bible. I had bought it in Edinburgh during my second year, originally to improve my arguments against Christianity by reading the source material directly rather than relying on Islamic descriptions of it. It had sat in my bookshelf in my room in Riyadh since I came back, spine out, between a legal textbook and a novel I had not finished. No one in the household had mentioned it. My mother had probably seen it and left it alone because she was my mother, and she trusted me. While I left the dinner table, went to my room, and came back with the Bible. I held it up and said I would read from it so everyone could hear for themselves exactly what Christians believed and why it was absurd. The table laughed. My father raised an eyebrow that was not disapproval, more curiosity about where I was going with this. My younger brothers immediately leaned forward the way they always did when I was about to perform something. I sat down and opened the book. I started with John chapter 1. I had chosen it deliberately because it opened with what I considered the most theologically overreaching claim in the entire New Testament. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I read it out loud in my clearest, most theatrical voice, the one I used when I was about to demonstrate why something was wrong. I paused after it and looked around the table with my eyebrows raised, inviting everyone to appreciate how strange this was. A word being with God and simultaneously being God, as though God and his own speech were 2 separate entities that also happened to be the same entity. My uncle laughed. Saad shook his head again. I kept reading. I read through the first several verses. The word being the means of all creation, light coming into darkness, the darkness not overcoming it. I was reading with performance, spacing the sentences for comic effect. I glancing up occasionally to collect reactions. The table was with me. People were eating and listening and shaking their heads at the theological strangeness of it all. Then I reached verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. I read the verse. I looked up for my usual pause, but something had happened to my voice on the last 4 words. Full of grace and truth. I had read them in the same theatrical tone I was using for everything else, but they landed differently than the other words had landed. Not on the room, on me, like a bell struck too close to your ear. I looked it back down at the page. I kept reading. My voice was still working. The table did not notice anything had changed. But something had changed, something in the quality of my attention. I was no longer performing, I was reading. The difference was subtle from the outside, but from the inside, it was complete. I got through chapter 1 and closed the Bible and made some remarks about how circular the logic was, and how it sounded very different from the clear monotheism of the Quran. The table agreed. My father nodded. The dinner moved on to other topics. I put the Bible on the arm of my chair and later carried it back to my room. That night I opened it again, alone, no audience, no performance. I went back to John chapter 1 and read it from the beginning again, slowly this time, the way I had watched Thomas's father read by the firelight, not to find the weak points, just to read it, full of grace and truth. I sat with those 4 words for a while. I did not know why they had done what they did to my voice. I did not know why I was sitting in my room at midnight reading this book alone when I had finished with it at the dinner table as an exhibit. I kept reading. Chapter 2, Chapter 3, John chapter 3 verse 16. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. I had heard this verse before. I had used it in arguments, pointing out that the idea of God having a son was incompatible with God's complete oneness, that the very concept reduced God to something biological. I knew the argument. I had made it well many times. But reading it alone in my room at midnight, the argument did not come. What came instead was a question I had never asked before. Not what is wrong with this verse, but what would it mean if it were true? I closed the Bible and put it on my desk. I looked at it for a moment. It was just a book, paper and ink and a cloth cover. It was not dangerous. I was a trained lawyer with a sharp mind and a complete Islamic education. No book was going to undo any of that. I went to sleep. I dreamed nothing memorable. I woke up and performed Fajr prayer and went about my day. But the question I had asked myself at midnight was still there in the morning, small and quiet and persistent. What would it mean if it were true? Over the next 2 weeks, I kept returning to the Bible in the evenings. I told myself it was research. I was continuing my study of Christian arguments the way I had done in Edinburgh, building a stronger case against them by understanding them better. I told myself this every evening when I opened the book. I mostly believed it until I got to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 and read the Beatitudes and sat there for 20 minutes without any argument forming at all, just a feeling I could not identify. Something between being very hungry and being offered food by someone you were not sure you trusted. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. I had grown up in a world where the poor in spirit were people to be pitied or instructed, where mourning was something you moved through quickly because God's will was not to be grieved too long, where meekness was not a quality that inherited anything. Power inherited things, strength inherited things, sharp minds in the right rooms with the right names inherited things. And here was this teacher in 1st century Galilee telling a crowd of ordinary people that the ones who had nothing, who were grieving, who were soft rather than hard, those were the ones the kingdom belongs to. I did not find this absurd. I found it the most serious thing I had read in a very long time. I sat with it until the room got dark around me and I had to turn on the lamp. I did not tell anyone what I was doing with the book I had carried into the family dinner as a prop. Almost 6 weeks after the family dinner, I contacted a Christian pastor in London. His name was Pastor Michael, and I had found him through a website connected to a ministry that worked specifically with people from Muslim backgrounds who were exploring Christianity. I had spent 3 evenings reading the website carefully before I sent the email, the way I examine any source before using it, checking for bias and agenda and the quality of the thinking. The thinking was better than I expected. I sent the email at 11 at night from my personal laptop with the door to my room closed. I told him I was from a Muslim background and studying Christianity academically. I said I had theological questions I wanted to discuss with someone who knew the material well. I said I was not interested in being converted. I said I wanted honest intellectual engagement. Every word of that email was true, and every word of it was also a way of protecting myself from what I was actually doing, which was reaching out from inside a compound in Riyadh to a Christian pastor because I had read the Sermon on the Mount alone in the dark and had not been able to put it down. He responded the next morning. He said he would be glad to talk. He said intellectual engagement was the only kind worth having. That's who he said he would not try to convert me. And that was not because he did not believe what he believed, but because he understood that nobody came to faith by being pushed, and that his job was to answer questions honestly, not to close a sale. That last phrase made me trust him slightly more than I expected to. We began meeting on video calls once a week. I asked questions and he answered them, and I pushed back on the answers. And he pushed back on my pushback, and we went back and forth with the kind of careful seriousness that I had found in only the best of my law professors. He did not simplify things to make them easy for me. He did not treat me as a project. He treated me as someone who was thinking hard and deserved to be thought at seriously in return. I asked about the Trinity again. This time not to dismiss it, but to actually understand the internal logic of it. He walked me through it carefully. Not three gods, one God, eternally existing as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, three persons sharing one divine nature. He said no human analogy could fully capture it because no human thing worked exactly this way. But he offered several comparisons that showed the concept was not irrational, just beyond the range of ordinary categories. He said the Quran itself described Jesus as the Word of God and as a Spirit from God, and asked me whether those descriptions, taken seriously, were consistent with Jesus being simply one prophet among many, or whether they suggested something the Quran itself was struggling to categorize. I had never heard that argument before. I sat with it for 3 days after that call. I asked about the crucifixion. I told him the Quran said it only appeared to happen, that God saved Jesus from death. He said the historical evidence for the crucifixion was better documented than almost any other event from that period, confirmed by Roman historians, Jewish sources, and the early Christian writers who had every reason to avoid the story of a crucified Messiah if they were trying to attract followers. He said the question the New Testament asked was not whether it happened, but what it meant. And then he explained it. God taking on human form in order to enter fully into human suffering and death and carry the weight of everything broken about human beings through it and out the other side. Not God punishing his son, God himself coming down to do what no human could do for themselves. I pushed back hard on this. I said it made God sound weak. I said a God who had to die to fix a problem was a God with limited options. He said I was thinking about it upside down. He said the question was not whether God needed to do it. The question was whether God chose to do it. That there was a difference between being required to sacrifice yourself and in choosing to. That the whole point was the choice. That love that costs nothing is not love in any meaningful sense. I did not have a response to that immediately. I filed it in the part of my mind where I kept things I was still working on. We talked for 2 months, once a week, sometimes longer. I was reading the New Testament in parallel, finishing it and starting again at Matthew, going more slowly the second time. I was also reading books he recommended, careful academic work on the historical reliability of the Gospels, on the manuscript evidence, on what scholars outside Christianity said about the early church and the claims it made. I was building a case the way I would build a legal case, gathering evidence, testing it, identifying what held and what did not. What I found was that the case for Christianity was considerably stronger than anything my Islamic education had equipped me to expect. The manuscript evidence was real. The early dating of the Gospels was real. The fact that the disciples died for claims they could have recanted, claims they had personally witnessed and not inherited secondhand, that was real. I had been taught the Bible was hopelessly corrupted and historically unreliable. I had taught others the same thing with complete confidence. The evidence did not support that position. I thought about all the time I had made people laugh by pointing at Christian beliefs as though they were obviously absurd. I thought about the Edinburgh students who had not had good answers. Some of them had not had good answers because they had not thought carefully. But some of them had not had good answers because they were simply in the wrong room, debating the wrong version of me. And the right version of me would have been harder to make laugh. In the 9th week of our calls, Pastor Michael asked me a question I had not been asked before. He said, setting aside the theological arguments for a moment, what did I actually want from God? Not what did I believe intellectually. What did I want? What was I looking for when I went into that Bible alone at night after using it as a probe at a dinner table? I sat with the question for a long time without answering. He waited. He was good at waiting. I said, I think I wanted to know if God was real, in the way my mother knew God was real, not as a set of correct positions, as a person, as someone present. He said that was the most honest thing I had said in 9 weeks of calls. He said that was exactly what Jesus promised to people who came looking. Not more information, himself. I drove home from the mosque that Friday with his words in my head. Not the theological arguments, the one quiet sentence. Not more information, himself. That night I prayed alone in my room. Not the ritual prayer facing Mecca with the structured Arabic phrases I had recited since childhood. I just talked, out loud quietly, in the dark of my room with the door closed. I said I had been reading the Gospels for 3 months. I said I thought Jesus was who he said he was. I said I did not fully understand the Trinity, and I did not fully understand the atonement, and I did not fully understand how a virgin birth worked biologically. And none of that felt like the main point anymore. The main point felt like the question Pastor Michael had asked me. What did I want? I said I wanted what my mother had. I said I wanted the real God and not a performance of him. I said if Jesus was the real God, then I was asking him to show me. And if he was not, then nothing would happen and I would have talked to an empty room. I sat in the quiet for a while. No voice from the ceiling. No light through the window. Just the silence and my own breathing and the distant sound of the city outside. But the silence felt inhabited. That is the only way I know how to describe it. Like a room that looks empty but is not. Like the moment in a conversation when no one is speaking but both people are still completely present. I stayed in that room for a long time. When I finally lay down to sleep, I was not the same person who had sat down. Something had settled. Something had come to rest that had been moving and restless for as long as I could remember. I did not know yet all of what it would cost me, but I knew it was true. And I knew that knowing something was true, really knowing it, was worth more than every room I had ever made laugh. I told my mother first. I had thought carefully about the order. My father was the one whose response would determine everything else, the way a keystone determines whether an arch stands or falls. But my mother was the one who had been with God long enough and closely enough that she might understand what I was actually telling her before she had time to be afraid of what it meant. I found her alone in the garden on a Tuesday morning, sitting in the small chair she kept beside the jasmine. The morning was cool and the jasmine was still, and the light was the kind of pale gold that only happens in Riyadh in the early hours before the heat builds. She was reading Quran. She looked up when she heard my footsteps on the stone path and she smiled. The way she always smiled when one of her sons came to find her. Unhurried, genuinely glad. I sat on the ground beside her chair. I did not build up to it. I had learned from 3 months of honest conversations with Pastor Michael that the most important things did not improve with extended preparation. I told her I had been reading the Bible for 3 months. I told her I had been talking with a Christian pastor in London. I told her I had come to believe that Jesus was the Son of God and that his death and resurrection were real, and that the forgiveness he offered was real. I told her I was sorry for what this would do to the family. But I told her I loved her and I needed her to know before I told my father. She went very still, not the way my father went still, which was a stillness that meant a decision was being made. Her stillness was different. It was the stillness of a woman holding something heavy and feeling its weight before she decided how to carry it. She said very quietly that she had known something was changing in me. She said a mother knows. She said she had been praying for me for 3 months without knowing exactly what she was praying about, just that her son needed something from God that she could not give him herself. Then she wept, quietly without drama, in the way that she did most things. She held my hand and wept. She did not tell me I was wrong. She did not tell me to recant. She said she did not understand and she was afraid for me and she loved me completely. Those 3 things at the same time, without any of them canceling the others out. I wept too. For the first time since I was a small child, I sat in the garden with my mother and wept and was not ashamed of it. I did not fully understand then that this would be one of the last unhurried mornings I would have in that house for a very long time. I told my father that evening. He was in his study. I knocked and he said, "Come in," and I came in and closed the door. He was at his desk with the same steady posture he always had, the one that said his position in any room was not a performance but a fact. I sat across from him. I told him everything I had told my mother, in the same order, with the same words. I did not soften it. I had learned it from watching my father my whole life that he respected people who said things directly more than people who tried to manage how the thing landed. I said it directly. He listened without moving. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough for me to count 20 seconds in my head. Then he said, in a voice that was not angry but was completely final, that what I had told him was not possible. He said I was not a Christian. He said I was a confused young man who had spent too much time in Western universities and been manipulated by people who targeted Muslims. He said I would take 3 days to pray and fast and return to myself, and then we would not speak of this again. I said, respectfully, that 3 days would not change what I knew to be true. He said then I was not to discuss this with my brothers or anyone in the household. He said we would handle it privately. He said I should go to my room. I went to my room. Over the following week, my father brought 2 imams to the house to speak with me. Both were serious and educated men who knew Islamic theology thoroughly. I met with each of them for several hours. I answered their questions honestly. Now I told them what I had read and what I had concluded and what I had experienced alone in my room on the night I stopped performing and started praying. They gave me careful arguments. I had heard most of them before in my own mouth. I listened respectfully and I did not change. My father's response after the second imam reported back was swift and quiet in the way that my father's decisions always were. I was told I would be going to stay with a cousin in Dubai for an extended period. Now I was told this was for my own good, to separate me from outside influences and return me to a stable environment. I was told my stipend would continue, but that access to my bank accounts required his co-signature for any withdrawal above a modest daily amount. I was told my passport would be kept in the family safe during this period for safekeeping. I understood what this meant. I was not under arrest, but I was not free. I spent 2 weeks in Dubai appearing to comply while I worked quietly with Pastor Michael and the same Christian legal organization that had helped Faisal, a man whose story I would not hear until much later, but whose path I was now beginning to follow without knowing it. They moved carefully. I will not describe the details because some of what was done involved people who are still in that region, and I will protect them completely. What I will say is that on a Thursday morning in March, I boarded a flight to London with a bag containing 1 change of clothes, my laptop, and the Bible that had started everything. I landed in London in the rain. I stood outside Heathrow in the cold, wet air and looked at the grey sky and breathed in and breathed out and understood for the first time in my life what it felt like to be somewhere with no weight of name or family or compound bearing down on me from above. It did not feel like freedom the way I had always imagined freedom feeling, light and open and without consequence. It felt heavier than that and more real. It felt like the beginning of something that would require everything I had. Pastor Michael met me at a church hall in South London, where a small group of people who had walked similar paths were waiting. Men and women from different Muslim majority countries, different languages, different ages, all in various stages of a journey that had brought them to the same cold city and the same hall with bad lighting and good tea. I sat in a plastic chair in that circle and listened to their stories and understood that what had happened to me in a garden with Jasmine and a garden chair was not unusual or isolated. God had been doing this for a long time, meeting people where they were, showing up in the places they least expected. Asking the question that the Bible reading at the dinner table had been designed to prevent anyone from asking honestly. I was baptized 4 months after arriving in London. It was a small ceremony, a church with old stone walls and new windows, and about 60 people, some from the group at the hall, some from Pastor Michael's congregation who had prayed for me by name without knowing me. I stood in the water and came up out of it. And one of the older women in the group began clapping, and then everyone was clapping. And I laughed, the first real laugh I had laughed since leaving Riyadh, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than performance. My father and I have not spoken since the morning I left for Dubai. I have written to him twice. He has not responded. I wrote to my mother separately, and she wrote back a single message saying she prayed for me every day and loved me and could not correspond further. I carry her with me in a way I cannot fully explain. Her face by morning light with the Quran open in her hands. The same settled certainty I saw in Thomas's father by the firelight in Scotland. She and that Scottish farmer had never met and shared nothing except the one thing that turned out to be the only thing that mattered. My brothers do not contact me. My cousins follow my father's position. The community I grew up in considers me a cautionary tale about the dangers of Western education and insufficient roots. I understand why they see it that way. I used to see it that way myself about other people. What I understand now that I did not understand at that dinner table with a Bible in my hand and a room full of family watching me perform is that the Word of God is not a prop. You can pick it up for the wrong reasons. You can carry it into the wrong room and use it as a weapon against the people it belongs to. But the word itself does not change based on how you are holding it. It says what it says. And if you are in the same room as it long enough, alone at midnight, with the performance finished and the audience gone, it begins to address you directly in a voice that is quiet and patient, and has been waiting for exactly this moment when you stopped being clever and started being honest, full of grace and truth. I read those 4 words as a joke, and they broke something open that I have been grateful for ever since. I lost my family and my name and my country and my inheritance. I gained the one thing my mother had that I had always wanted without knowing I was looking for it. Not information about God. God Himself, present, real, recognizing my face the way He recognized my voice in that empty room when I finally stopped performing and spoke to Him directly. I am 30 years old now and I live in London, and I work with Pastor Michael, helping other people from backgrounds like mine who are asking questions they are afraid to ask out loud. I sit with them in rooms with bad lighting and good tea. I answer questions carefully and honestly. I do not push, I wait. I have learned from the God who waited for me through 26 years of performance and arguments and a Bible read as mockery at a family dinner that patience is not passivity. It is the most serious kind of love there is. If you are reading this and you have been holding something at arm's length, examining it for weaknesses, performing confidence you do not entirely feel, I want you to know what I know. The book does not care how you picked it up. The God does not care that you came in through the wrong door. He is already in the room. He has been there the whole time. And He knows your name, not your family's name, yours. That is what I found when I stopped making people laugh and started reading alone in the dark. And it was worth every single thing it cost me.